Welcome back, everyone. This is Jose Nino here with another episode of El Nino Speaks. Today, I have the pleasure of bringing on Jordan, who I've found to be one of the more insightful people in the America First Groyper space. And before we start, Jordan, give my audience a brief overview of your background.
Yeah, man, like you said, I've kind of been in that America First, Groyper adjacent Catholic reactionary sphere. I'd probably say since around 2019 or 2020. I've, been to several of Nick Fuentes's events. Hit not everything I say he believes, not, 100% of what he says I believe. Probably 99.5% of what he says I believe. So, yeah, I'm pretty adjacent to that sphere. Yeah, I've been on Twitter for, 7 years at this point. I've had my YouTube channel for a few years. I took a couple year hiatus while I kind of reconnected with the Catholic faith. But yeah, I've been around this sphere for a while. I've seen a lot of people come and go, and I think I offer a unique perspective as far as kind of race realism and African American issues in the United States specifically.
That is exactly why I brought you on, because given your African American Black background, for obvious reasons, it's very difficult to find people of African extraction in the United States that can talk candidly about the realities of race, because you obviously have the typical leftist liberal blacks that are on some shape or form are black supremacists that want a system that benefits blacks at the expense of everybody else. And then on the so-called opposition of the acceptable political discourse, you have black conservatives that will be correct in criticizing their more radical cohorts, but they don't really offer much in terms of solutions. And many of them, when you push them hard enough, they start sounding incredibly unhinged and fulfill many of the stereotypes that have been proven time and time again about the Black community in the
1000%.
United States. And
Yeah.
your perspective, I think, is very unique because you've gone through from what I've gathered, you've gone through some of the typical conservative libertarian pipelines, but have arrived to a much more unconventional position on your political development that I think separates you from 99.9% of blacks. And moreover, it separates you from the acceptable conservatism Inc. black sphere. What got you
Absolutely.
into politics and eventually made you become race realist?
Yeah, so that's such a great way of starting such a great way of framing the discussion to start out. So I think what started my kind of, if you want to call it dissent, I would call it my ascent. My dad, maybe this is where it starts, is I'm a little bit of a statistical anomaly. Dad heavily involved in my life, still involved in my life to this day. He was a Republican, normie conservative. Michael Savage, Bill O'Reilly, Glenn Beck, talk radio listener, that milieu. He wasn't heavily involved politically, but as far as the content that I was listening to on a daily basis, it was very much talk radio. And as I got older and became more politically aware, I think what my dad tried to, and I respect him for this isn't a knock on him, but he didn't have all the necessary facts, and I think when I got to a certain age, he was trying to steer me towards Thomas Sowell, libertarianism, the idea that blacks were better off before big bad government stepped in. And before that, blacks were just fine. And it was the racist Democrats that pulled the wool over the unassuming black people's eyes and made them commit crime, which is basically what the claim is by Thomas Sowell, that big government made blacks commit crime. So that would probably be where I say that I started kind of my libertarian phase of, well, if we just got government out of the way, then blacks would be fine. Because if you look at the fatherlessness rate before the big state stepped in, everything was fine, which isn't true. We can get into why that's the myth of Thomas Sowell's myth that he pushes. But it really started there. I think really the big turning point for me, and this is going to be a throwback name to maybe you or people who are listening, but Stefan Molyneux.
Oh
Was
yes, yes.
that was really where the turning point happened, was around 2016, 2017. Started to find all the people that we know and love now. Found Molyneux, found the truth about crime, and found out that you can't ignore the impact of genes on behavior. And that's, once you go down that path, you inevitably end up where I am. If you're honest with yourself, at least, that you inevitably end up where I'm at right now.
There's a lot to unpack there. And another reason I found your background interesting as well is that we both grew up in the DFW area, and we're of like the same generational cohort as well. And with the Carmelo Anthony case that happened, it really hit home because Frisco is quite close to where I grew up in the DFW area in Coppell, North Dallas. And I used to run track as well.
It's close to where I live, so it hit home for me also because, it's hard to believe that, and you can attest to this. Frisco is not some slum.
No.
It's not they didn't have them resources. They didn't have enough textbooks. That's why the entire facade of the nature versus nurture argument, the whole nature argument goes away when you see someone like Carmelo Anthony, who's had every privilege afforded to him. The average income in Frisco is $154,000.
Yeah.
But he acts no differently than somebody who grew up, and you know what I mean, who grew up on the south side of Oak Cliff.
Yeah, like Duncanville, yeah.
Duncanville, whatever. So I'll let you keep going, but totally, man.
Yeah, I'm curious, where in Frisco did Carmelo Anthony attend high school?
Well, I want to say it was the eastern side of Frisco that buttresses against McKinney. So that McKinney, Allen, Frisco triad thing, far north up 75. If you go west of 75 but east of Frisco, that area. And again, I went there for the Austin Metcalf rally a couple weeks ago. Again, it's my first time that I'd been there in a couple years, but great area, incredible.
Yes.
If you looked around, you would be like, a murder happened here? How?
Yeah, 100%. The track part 2 brings back some memories because you obviously have like the race realist fact of like just the fact that, like, let's be real, in any type of sprinting event,
fast twitch,
people with West African genetics are going to dominate that. And then like when it comes to distance running, you're going to see the more East African types dominate. Whites, like a lot of Nordics and Northern Europeans, they can hold their own, but when it comes to like Kenyans and stuff like that, it's going to be really difficult to beat. But at the track meet, one thing I remember this, and
especially female Nordics also, they really hold their own. Sorry. Anyway.
No, it's actually funny. I've noticed some of these sprinters too. I'm seeing some male Nordics start to like actually do quite well because when I ran track, I ran the 400 and 800, and one of the summer camps I was in, the majority of the white people that were running there were actually from like either like Norway or like Sweden. Like when I was doing this one little like summer camp thing, like in Rhode Island, this was like, oh man, think 08, 07. But that said, some of the extracurricular stuff that would happen at these track meets and competitions, looking back at it with like a race realist lens, made me realize a lot of things, because I just remember at track meets, like the runners that sucked, like the Black and Hispanic runners that sucked, they'd be like doing all sorts of shit, like selling drugs, getting into all sorts of trouble, the typical stuff you would associate with hood culture. And a lot of these meets, they were going down in like very upscale high schools in like suburbs and stuff like that. It wasn't like being held like in Duncanville and whatnot, or any place in like South Dallas. So a lot of this stuff was jumping off there. So like a dude getting shanked at a track meet, especially when you look at the demographic of people like in the DFW area, it's not surprising because a lot of those track meets, they're going to be very multiracial as well. And when those people interact, something's gonna kick off, and like it doesn't matter if you put like somebody, especially like a guy like Carmelo Anthony. I don't know much of his background where he like grew up outside of like Frisco in the DFW area, but if you put any black person there or any concentration of black people in like the Frisco area, you're gonna get the problems that are associated with the black community there.
Absolutely. And what's funny about that is that's almost that's a microcosm of society as a whole. If you have an individual black person, and this is not a steadfast rule, it's just observations, what you can tell is true. If you have one single black person in an event, the odds that their behavior metastasize across the group are unlikely, because most people don't behave like black people. Whites don't behave like blacks. Hispanics, a little bit more. Asians, much less. But once you start getting 10% of the group being black, they start grouping together. They start hyping each other up. Oh, let's go beat him up. Oh, you see that bag over there? Let's get that. That sounds like a crude characterization, but anybody, like you're saying, who's been in these situations knows that that is not a crude characterization. That's in fact what happens. Blacks, once you get a tipping point, I don't know what that percentage is. Maybe it's 10, 20, whatever. Once you get in that sphere and over, you may as well be in Duncanville, which for anybody not from the DFW area means the hood. It turns into that once you get enough of that behavior that starts, they hype each other up. It's totally real.
I noticed that as well in some of the track meets too. Even within the high schools, like South Grand Prairie, who was in our district,
Mm-hmm.
that was actually like kind of split between Hispanics and blacks. So it got clicked up within it. With like the runners from the same high school, they would be like segregating themselves along racial lines. And in Coppell, when you go to like the cafeteria, it'd be like straight up racial hierarchy. I used to roll with a lot of the Hispanic people, but I was always kind of on the outside because I'm Venezuelan. I was originally from Venezuela, and
Okay.
the Mexican Americans and then like the actual like Mexican immigrants, they always saw me as kind of an outsider. So I was kind of somewhat floating around. I eventually ended up hanging out with more like nerdy people that were made up of whites and Asians towards like the final years of like high school. But there was a black contingent that grew bigger because of Hurricane Katrina. A lot of people from Louisiana came in, and that's when things started to kind of jump off at my high school. Like people would be catching beatdowns, and you'd have like stabbing incidents every now and then, and people getting jumped. And I noticed as well that the racial cliques, like especially among the Hispanics and the more fob Korean types, they started to really click up. And the biggest gang in my area, which cut across not just Coppell but also Carrollton, was actually a Korean gang, like the biggest like ethnic gang. It wasn't like a black gang or anything. And then
Wow.
if you went to like Valley Ranch and some parts of Irving, you'd see like kind of a Latin King affiliates, because in the track meets, I noticed a ton of Latin King types, and I actually was even approached by them. They were kind of trying to get all buddy with me. I think it was part of like a long-term ploy to get me like to join that shit, but I was like just not on that type of time at that point.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. Valley Ranch, Las Colinas, you're talking my language, man. That's I was, I don't privileged. I don't mean it in the leftist sense. I mean, like, I was privileged enough to have a family to where I could attend I attended private school, kindergarten through 12th grade, actually. So a lot of those things, are foreign to me, and this is kind of we can go this way or that way. It's totally up to you. But, going to those private schools, you're not immune even from it there, because you're still playing tournaments. So you were a track participant, right? I did high school basketball. I was a basketball player.
Shit. Okay.
So I completely get it. So like, we're a mid-sized 3A TAPS high school that I went to and graduated from, but you still go to tournaments in the preseason. You're still facing, teams from Katy, Houston in the final four of your postseason. So you're even at that level, you're not subject to it. And then even at a personal level, just because I went to those private schools, my personal familiarity with the Black community comes from my dad kind of introducing me to that side of the family, which is from Jackson, Mississippi. You can guess what's going on with that side of the
Oh,
family.
yeah. Oh, yo, that.
So, I mean,
Yeah.
so I've seen it. What I'm saying is I've seen, even if it sounds like, well, why would this guy know anything about the Black community? It's like, you're never, especially as a Black person. I heard somebody joke about it. I think it was even like I forgot who it was, but it was some well-to-do conservative. And he had a great point. He said, as a Black person, even as a well-to-do Black person, you are never more than 1 degree from criminality, even in the most upper class family you can think of.
Oh,
So
100%.
the perfect example I can think of is Simone Biles, the gymnast. You know her?
Yes.
Simone Biles. She's like this well-spoken. If you heard her in an interview, you would think she was white. If you didn't see her face, you would think she was just a girl from the Valley in LA. Talks like a white girl, does gymnastics, the whole nine. Her brother is a gang member and was shot and killed, I think, in Atlanta a few years ago. He was doing drug dealing. He was shot in a drive-by. The point, and I know that sounds like a one-off, but the point there is that it's true. No matter what you're doing, even if you are in the most well-to-do white areas, a Black
It'd be
person,
like Tom Dubois.
yeah, Carlton Banks, like even in that show, if you zoomed out from the Banks family just a little bit, there was likely a cloud of criminality even around that family that they had to escape from. And I don't mean escape from like Blacks they're so beat down that they just have criminal. I mean, like, they make these choices to be actively criminal, even though they may even have an off ramp. And that's perfectly encapsulated with Simone Biles' brother. It's not like he was struggling to eat food. You know what I mean? If he wanted to be on the straight and narrow, he has a sister right there who's a decamillionaire, a centimillionaire, but he's dead because he still couldn't get away from that life. And that's it's kind of a testament to the genes, if you want to be honest with you. So anyway, I didn't mean to go off ramp there, but
no, even I can attest to this in personal life as well. When I was in Washington, D.C. doing political work, and this was like feels like almost eons ago, but I was not just around like the typical hood rat Blacks, but also more educated, like upper scale Blacks. And they still would engage in a lot, like I would say, like higher IQ criminality and stuff like that, or they would make excuses for their Pookies and Ray Rays and their families. Exactly. And this makes, and the
Pookie and Ray Ray. Really, exactly. Memory unlocked there. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, because you can put a person like that in a pretty upper crust environment, but all things being equal, though, when you have a lot of other Blacks clustered, there's always going to be a regression to the mean.
Well, the regression to the mean thing is really one of the original terms that Molyneux, he obviously didn't coin that term, but that topic of regression to the mean really hit home with me, because I'm growing up and I see my dad. He's obviously a Black guy, worked hard his whole life, never didn't have a job, was actually a bodybuilder. If you look at bodybuilding, it's, even though Black people may have, this is totally different thing. I like this convo. Even though Black people have the genes to be great bodybuilders, there's an underrepresentation of Blacks, because being a bodybuilder is something that takes years and even decades of commitment.
Yes.
Going to the gym. Discipline. I mean, every day you got to be at the gym. You have to be watching your macros, your calories, your intake, all of it. Clearly, I didn't. I chose the more intellectual path than the bodybuilding path. But I'm watching my dad do all these high IQ things that I wasn't consciously aware of, that were high IQ or even above the fray, if you will. But then I look at the family, and it's not to denigrate them. It's just, again, it's just stating facts. I look at the family that is in that cloud around us, and they're calling him every weekend, asking him for $20 here, $40 there. My dad's asking him, why haven't you gotten a job yet? And they're like, man, it's hard out there. I can't get no job. That's not true.
Uh,
This is the mid 2000s. Everybody's hiring. This is 2005. Nobody's not hiring. And the regression to the mean thing kind of made me realize that, yeah, my dad is an outstanding guy. I'm an outstanding guy. That doesn't disprove the fact that averages exist. If anything,
yes.
the exception does not disprove the rule. The exception actually proves the rule. And Molyneux kind of uh, unlocking that in my head that the regression to the mean is real was a big one for me, to be honest.
That point you raised about like your dad's side of the family having like family members calling him for help, that rang a bell for me as well. Because on my mom's side of the family, because I come from a multiracial background, she is Afro-Colombian. And I get so many of the same calls from members of her family. And this goes to show that this goes across. This is like a racial thing because we're talking about a country like Colombia, like Caribbean Colombia, which when you look at the racial demographics there, it's predominantly of West African slaves that were brought over there that honestly would have probably been like cousins, like second or third cousins to like the slaves brought over to the United States. So that this crosses cultural lines. You see these type of things happening because as people who are aware of these issues know, the culture is the expression of the genes. It's not like, yeah, like that's the thing. And
that's the red pill.
Yeah, that's
race,
real
at least.
red pill.
Yes.
Yep.
Whenever I talk to, and I think this parlays nicely into what you said at the beginning. I kind of want to take it here, if you want
to
show, but the culture being the expression of the genes is kind of the blind spot for right-wing black, however few there are, is kind of the blind spot for conservative blacks, not red-pilled like me. And I'm not
it's
trying to be holier than thou, but I'm saying like your average Thomas Sowell or C.J. Pearson.
Yeah, normies.
The normie conservative blacks. That's the blind spot, is that the culture is the expression of the genes, and that's perfectly represented when you talk to a conservative, white or black, and you'll ask the most normie racist conservative that you can think of, what's the biggest problem with the black community? They think that they are really pushing the edge here when they say, it's the culture, man. It's black culture that's the problem. Black culture is the reason that they are committing crime. The reason they're committing crime is because a culture of fatherlessness, a culture of rap music, a culture of laziness. What they don't understand is that those are characteristics that are derived from an upstream of genes. Those carry down from genes. So, for example, fatherlessness. Conservatives love to beat that drum. They love to say that. The reason fatherlessness exists, I was saying this in my last video on my YouTube channel, the reason that exists is because when you have an average IQ of 85, you have high time preference. And if you have a child that is costing you more money than you are bringing in, you're going to say, forget this kid. I'm out. I could save money if I just leave this family. I'm done. There is no low time preference to where they say, wow, well, it would be immoral if I were to leave my child. Also, if I invest resources in my child, they may take care of me in the future. These kind of calculations that are 18, 20, 50 years down the road, they're not thinking like that. That is a direct reflection of genes.
That's not socioeconomic either.
That's not socioeconomic. It's not even slavery, because that's the other argument. If you want to go a level higher on the counter argument for that, they would say, well, no, it's because they learned fatherlessness from slavery. That's not true, because they don't even believe that, because they say that fatherlessness started when Big Daddy government stepped in the mid-60s. Like, they don't even believe that it started with slavery. Their best argument is that it started when Democrats started giving out welfare or something, which is ridiculous because it's even in your genes to accept something like welfare at that level, in a certain way, if you see what I'm getting at.
Well, if you go to Africa, or like sub-Saharan Africa, you see this across the socioeconomic board. For example, you go to the African village, there's like the big man there that's got like multiple baby mamas and it has tons of kids out of wedlock. And then you can extrapolate that to like the national level where you have these really high time preference kleptocratic African dictators that have like they do engage in the same behavior. You see it from a guy that's like almost like a multi-millionaire billionaire to the guy in like the shithole African village. That's
Hegel,
like the same trend.
Hegel talks about this in Race, Nationalism, and Imperialism. He details the characteristics and the nature of Africa, and he talks about how there was one tribe that they found where one man was responsible for like 600 children, because you have the Pareto principle playing out, you have hypergamy playing out, morality. They're not, and I'll be honest, this is kind of where I struggle with morality and nature. I think there you can square that circle. I'm just saying I struggle with it. But when you get below a certain IQ threshold, morality is tough to fully act out in a way. I struggle with that a little bit, but it's real. Sorry to cut you off, man.
No, it's absolutely real. And no, I think we're going in the right direction here because I had the one question I had on deck, like just heading into this conversation, was about the point you raised earlier with respect to pre-welfare state Black America. Because there's a common meme from conservatives and even libertarian economists that say that before the welfare state came into the picture, the Black community was actually quite stable. Now, there is a sliver of truth, a very tiny sliver of truth, but I've seen you go off on this, and I generally agree with you based on what I've been actually reading with regards to the autobiography of Malcolm X, because even in that book, too, he was talking about the same stuff afflicting the Black community in the 30s, in the 20s and 30s. Yeah, he was talking about the same stuff. And that's when he was also a criminal, too, before he became like more of a Black nationalist advocate. Like, that's one part of his life that isn't really talked about when he was Detroit Red. So just going back here, what do you think is the main flaw behind that argument that conservatives and libertarians make with regards to the Black community in the pre-welfare state era?
So what you just said there about there being a sliver of truth, there's two things that offer that part that's kind of true. They take that 10 or 20% that's true and try to say that that's the whole story. So the sliver of truth there is that, yes, the out of wedlock birth rate and the murder rate, crime rate, whatever you want to call it, were significantly lower in the 50s and before compared to today. That's all they look at. They just look at, was it lower in the 50s compared to 2025? They zoom in on Black violence, Black out of wedlock birth rates, and they say it was lower in 1950 and it's higher now. Big Daddy government stepped in. But if you zoom out and look at the 1950s as a whole compared to all racial groups, Black out of wedlock birth rate was at, I want to say, 25 to 28%, even as late as 1962, 1963. The average rate among non-Blacks was 8%. So even back then, you had an overrepresentation. You had a serious problem that was just not manifesting quite yet. But if you lived back then, you would say, oh, they have a serious problem with the out of wedlock birth rate. The only difference is just magnitude. It's gotten worse for everybody, but it was always worse. The way I put it is it's always been bad. It was just kind of not as bad then. That it was always bad. It's always been horrible, even back into the 20s, 30s, like you're saying with Malcolm X. So that's one part. I would say that even going back to the 50s, 60s, it was still 4 or 5 times the national average rate. The other part, and this specifically relates to the crime rate, the reason that people say that, and they say Blacks were well behaved in the 50s and 60s before the Civil Rights Act, but this all happened at once. It was like a domino effect. You had the Civil Rights Act of 64. You had integration. You had Hart-Celler Act. You had a lot of things happening in the mid-60s. But one thing you did not have during that era when people are talking about Blacks were better in the 40s, you didn't have integration. So what happened? Integration. Exactly. You didn't have state enforced integration. So people can look back on that era and say blacks weren't committing crimes. They were just doing it within their own communities, and it wasn't affecting white people to the extent it is now because we are forced to live side by side. So back in the 40s and 50s, you could easily say, well, they're over there. I think they said in Mississippi Burning, if you're familiar with the movie, when the blacks were burning down their own neighborhood, the racist cops are standing back with their arms crossed, laughing, and they say, they're tearing down their own shithole. They're burning down their own shithole, or something like that. That was kind of the general feeling. They didn't feel the impetus of black crime. They didn't feel their public spaces being overran with someone smoking a joint because you didn't have integration. So I would say that those are really the two things that people miss. One, you have the fact that there was always an overrepresentation of out of wedlock birth rate and criminal behavior. And two, you didn't have the onus, you didn't have the impetus of forced integration that was bearing on white people or the public at large. So people don't really, they didn't view it as much of a problem as until you're forced to live next to these people, and then it becomes more of a problem. I would say those are kind of where people miss the boat on the everything was great before 1965 or whatever year they like to put it at.
Oh, you got that right. And one thing as well, given my historical background, when I started to become more race aware, I would actually go back to reading a lot of primary and secondary sources of people observing black behavior since the days of the early American Republic. And there is a reason why the anti-slavery advocates supported the American Colonization Society well into the 20th century. It didn't fold until I think like the 1920s or so.
So you're saying they still wanted separation. They just didn't think that slavery was moral.
Yeah. And even like the author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Harriet Beecher Stowe, I believe, said something to the effect like she saw blacks as like a totally different race. They had different behavior. And I'm not sure if she supported the American Colonization Society, but you had people ranging from the likes of Thomas Jefferson, John Calhoun, Henry Clay, like guys that were often butting heads with each other politically, agreeing on one thing, that blacks could not live like in a white European polity. And this is something that cut across the board in the US. And this is like based on their behavior, not just of the slaves, but also the freedmen.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you really look back at it. I mean, even World War II, when that was really the pinnacle of not back then, I'm saying now, the pinnacle of we all bled red, white, and blue, and we all attacked them Germans together. Even back then, what they would do with the black squadrons or the black platoons is they were almost used as like a vicious attack dog, because they knew they would, and sounds horrible, but it's true, they knew that they would rape and steal from the European women and cities that they sent them in to attack. They sent them in almost as a punishment. They would put a black barracks next to a German or a French village that they had conquered or taken or something, because they knew that they would behave that way. I don't know if you know this, but everybody knows the sort of Emmett Till.
I was going to say Emmett Till.
Emmett Till's dad is the example of this. Louis Till was shot by firing squad in Italy because he was convicted twice, not just once, twice of rape in Italy. He raped multiple women in Italy during World War II. And in that case, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So yeah, there's historical evidence behind this. The behavior simply has not changed. Like you're saying, when you go back and read the primary and secondary sources, these problems have been around since. That's why I almost question the motives a little bit of someone like Thomas Sowell, who on the right wing is considered, like sacrosanct. But I almost question, like, are you just ignoring this? Are you, because these issues have been around for hundreds of years, and to act like this just started because a policy was signed. Is
Look who's
ridiculous.
funding him.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not a coincidence that one of the only major interviews he's done in the last 10 years was with Dave Rubin. Dave Rubin sat down with him for, I think, 30 minutes. It's like one of the only interviews he's done. And yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if I don't know that for a fact. I'm just saying that wouldn't surprise me at all because that fits in with the idea that, blacks are fine unless whitey steps in.
Well, the thing is, too, this is where the JQ
It
steps
does
in.
tie in. It absolutely ties in.
Because you've got to look at blacks in the Judeo-American context, which is like the order that we have seen dominate since World War II, as the golems that they've
Yes.
largely created. And I'd even go as far, you could go trace it to the colonial era when a disproportionate amount of Sephardic Jewish slavers brought blacks to the U.S. for cheap labor.
Right.
Like cheap labor is off the desire to bring in cheap labor, and also white Gentiles partook in this too. But like, this desire for cheap labor is very high time preference, and it's destructive to civilizations.
Well, it's not
Especially when
high
you start
I would push back a little bit. It's not high time preference if you're the first mover in that case.
yeah.
It's not that they're high. It's not that the Jews were high time preference. It's just that they didn't care about the fabric of the society.
Yeah.
That they were that I'm not totally disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that in that dynamic, I wouldn't even call the Jews high time preference. I would say that they were acting. If you didn't care about the society that you were inflicting that upon, then yeah, that would be the right move because that's not your home. You have a home that's being created for you at that point in Israel, and that's their plan. They don't give,
Yeah, it's classic divide and rule.
They just don't care about what happens here. You know what I mean?
Well, yeah, I mean,
I would say that the Gentile part was the high time preference in that case of we just need them to pick the cotton and then we'll figure it out later. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, because when you understand like the whole notion of like having a multiracial society, it is designed specifically to become unstable. That's how when you understand the JQ, that's how you understand it, because when you have a multiracial society, it's going to always be like all these groups are going to be at each other's throats, while the puppet masters that created this problem, they just sit high on the hog and like benefit from the cheap labor, having all these consumer units, and also the instability, because they'll be able to like live in their compounds while everybody else is beefing with each other as the natural result of the multiracialism. Because when you have a multiracial polity, it's going to be unstable regardless of the ideology that undergirds it. That's just like a fact. Like,
absolutely. I think the only problem is that I don't know the extent to which modern blacks have the mental cognition to understand the puppet master dynamic. And that's the problem. When you talk to it, and I've been in this boat before where I've tried to do this and talk. I've literally been in the case where I've been at the black barber shop and tried to talk to them about how they feel about, the fact that there were Jewish slavers, the fact that Jews own XYZ, the rat meat, just trying to meet them at their level, right? And just say, well, a common one is why all the black rappers got to wear a dress. That's just a common refrain, a very, very base level talking point in the black community. They make us all wear a dress. They try to feminize the black men. And I go, well, do you know who's doing that, right? You know who runs media, right? Like, and I've been in that boat trying to explain that. I'm not joking. I'm not exaggerating. All it takes is about 2 minutes of discourse between them to get back to, man, they all just white anyway, and they all just hate us all anyway. They don't have, and I keep saying this, but it's true. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm not trying to be hateful. But when you have an IQ, a standard deviation below the average, below 100, it gets tough for you to work with multi-level thinking and say, well, okay, the whites are doing this, but who's controlling even the institutions that the whites are representatives of? And then you get into the fact that Jews look white, and this isn't a groundbreaking take. They don't have the ability to think.
Yeah, you can't think beyond like
they can't
level 3.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh, level 2 maybe. Yeah. And it gets difficult for them, and that's kind of why I think at this point, at least in terms of what you promote to Black people as far as the solution goes, is freedom of association, because that sounds good to them. That sounds really good to them to be like, these people hate you. You need to start your own business, and just tell them to start their own thing. And we can go down that path in a little bit. And I agree with you on the JQ issue. My only beef, not even beef, my only issue is the extent to which that it's even capable to explain that to somebody with a view of 85. Like, I've been there. It's difficult.
I've talked to some Nation of Islam heads whenever I encountered a lot of those in like the DC, Maryland area. And they even told me, and they were really blunt about this, that because of when they try to explain the whole JQ angle to other Blacks, because they could not, the other people they talked to could not grasp these concepts. They basically just ended up like these Nation of Islam types, appealing to them on like slop tier levels, and just would oftentimes even just kind of like assimilate into their really dumb behavior, because the peer pressure is so strong to fit in that a lot of these guys, these Nation of Islam types, would just like kind of revert to the hate whitey thing. That's been one of the big issues with NOI, that with like the Farrakhan and
Nation of Islam. Gotcha.
Yeah, Nation of Islam, is that they can't really, you can't explain these really high level philosophical, deep political topics to a person, as you said, that is cognitively impaired, if you will. And you cannot explain this. So your only option is just to like either engage, your only options are to engage in the typical anti-white politics, or just dumb yourself down to the point where the ideas you're talking about make no sense. Like, you basically have like no real options there. And that's one of the big struggles. And I actually do agree with you on the freedom of association thing. And I'm actually kind of white-pilled about this too.
I am too.
Because
yes, I want to go in on this. Yeah.
Because there is a legitimacy crisis in the US unfolding, because people are really losing faith in all the institutions. And if you look at the post-civil rights era, despite the forced integration, people are still self-segregating, and a lot now.
I've heard that it's at a higher rate, and I don't have a study behind this, but Richard Spencer, we both listened to his show, and he was talking about a study that he found that says that segregation rates are actually higher today than they were in the 50s. When you look at institutions that people choose to be in, whether it's private schools, churches, I forgot these other examples that he used, but he basically said that, like you're saying, self-segregation is becoming even, like, it may even be happening at a higher rate than it was even in the 50s.
Yes. Have you read the book, The Big Sort by Bill Bishop?
I've heard of it. I haven't read it yet.
So it doesn't really cover the race issue there, but it's almost implicit, because it mostly focuses on like people of certain political and cultural backgrounds that clustering together.
Stand in for race.
Race, yeah. Basically a stand in for race, yeah. And I think that book was way ahead of the curve when it was talking about that, because I'm in Charlotte now, in Charlotte, North Carolina. And one trend that's happening in the parts of the Sun Belt, especially like the Black Belt, where a lot of Blacks have historically been concentrated in throughout like the establishment of the United States, is you are seeing a reverse migration from northern urban centers to the South, where Blacks are clustering from like Atlanta, like Charlotte, like parts of like South Carolina, and even to a lesser extent, you see in Texas, like East Texas.
Houston is happening. Yeah, Louisiana, it's happening. That was the example I was going to use, was Louisiana. It's really boiling over with the school districts in Louisiana, to the extent that Baton Rouge's school district has split from Baton Rouge ISD to a new founded city that whites have founded called St. George. It's happening, and it actually went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court confirmed that yeah, they have the right to start their own city if they're not happy with the school district. And as we know, school districts are a stand-in for racial demographics. 100%.
Oh, 100%. 100%. Yeah. Even like from my times in Louisiana, you kind of see the geographic divide too, where northern Louisiana is like more of like an upper south, like it's more like white. And whereas like New Orleans, like the New Orleans dominated area, it's also like just much more multiracial. The politics there takes that like type of dynamic. And also interestingly, New Orleans is one of the cities that where organized Jewry has been very influential in the South, and they promote a lot of this multiracialism there. And you are seeing these dynamics unfold in a lot of states in the South, where people are just naturally clustering in along racial lines.
Yeah.
Regardless of like the regulations and all that, they find ways to do it.
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar. This was a big story on Twitter that even Jared Taylor was sharing. There's a new city about 45 minutes northeast of Allen.
Oh, Epic?
Epic, yeah. About 45 minutes in Josephine, Texas, from where I live. And it's not even a Sharia city. That's what the normie cons are going with, because
Yeah, the boomers,
like, that's a scare word for just like brown foreigners. But like, it's not even a Sharia city. It's a Muslim city. You have to be Muslim to live there. Muslim community colleges, Muslim recreation centers, Muslim houses, Muslim apartments. It is all Muslim. And you know, a lot of people, I know the reflexive reaction to that is to say, oh, no, disband that city. I almost lean into it. I'm almost like, yeah, let them form that city, because that creates a basis of a city, of an ideological concept that maybe someday, maybe it's not tomorrow, maybe it's not 5 years from now, but it creates a basis for maybe largely whites, 100% white, if that's what they choose to do. I'm an absolutist on freedom of association. And here's the other thing. Even if that excludes me, I'm like, you know what? That's their choice. I got to figure something out. And that's not an easy pill to swallow, but it's like, if they look at me and you know, I'm a devout Catholic, if you can't tell behind me, and they're like, no, you're brown, you can't live here. You know, that's what you're gambling with freedom of association. But that is an infinitely better society than the world we live in right now.
Oh, it's awful. It's a multiracial open air prison that with forced integration at the helm. Like, I do not like this order. I'm actually pretty white pilled about this, because if you look at South Africa, which is the most extreme case of multiracialism, the state there is so dysfunctional that like a city like that little town of Orania, white communities, that's like the model I like, where it's been able to emerge because the state is so dysfunctional that a lot of the whites there are able to organize pretty well. And I bet they've probably have like also like bribed like the insanely corrupt government to just give them like some space, because that it's funny because South Africa, like, even despite it being like a virulently anti-white state, it's so dysfunctional with the ethnic tensions amongst blacks. They beef amongst each other. So it gives like people space, like whites there, a little bit of space with Orania to like actually carve out their little statelet. And I think that is the model. And the freedom of association, honestly, one of the things that made me very hardcore libertarian was when I heard Ron Paul go against the Civil Rights Act of 1962, the forced integrations thing. That's when I became very hardcore political, because I'm like thinking like, this is so out of bounds, but it's such a great idea. It sounds like such a like great idea that challenges the norm, the accepted like norm that I like was like bought in, because I like when people like think outside the box and challenge a lot of like facets of this American civic religion that are taken for granted. And I think that this is going to become inevitable as like the US just becomes more dysfunctional. The natural tendency for humans is to congregate amongst their own. So, but
Right.
it is the most pragmatic way of doing stuff.
Yeah, I'm on the fence about that. I mean, now we're kind of getting into like theoretical physics here. Like there's really not a model. We're just kind of hypothesizing. The only thing I don't like about freedom of association, that being the way forward, is that it feels like retreat. There's no in the other part of my mind, I'm like, there's no reason white people should have to retreat from the cities they built. And that's
Yeah.
kind of what you're doing when you say, well, let's all just move to Idaho and create a city. It's like that is true. I think that is a human right to be able to congregate with your own. Absolutely. But part of me is almost like, why don't we just get somebody actually right wing who retakes the cities and like put somebody in a lithium mine for 5 years because they were caught smoking weed in public? You know what I mean? Like little things. That's not a little thing. It's a big thing. But I mean, like, what if you really brought back broken window policing, which is a bad word now in criminology? The idea that if you're not familiar, broken window policing was
Yes.
yeah. How they retook New York City, and famously, they wouldn't. The police wouldn't respond if they said there was if somebody called in and said there was a broken window. They wouldn't respond because they were pulled in other directions. What they started doing when they wanted to retake the city of New York, a New York person will correct me on this, but around the 80s, I guess, they started responding to broken windows, and they said, we're going to arrest anybody who's responsible for the broken window, and we're going to respond to all the calls. What I'm saying is, what if we actually had a true right-wing leader, and I don't think we're as far off from this as people think, somebody who says, you know what, I'm done with the stealing in the Lululemon store. Anybody caught stealing, 1 year in jail minimum. I'm overriding the courts. You're going to jail. You know what I mean? Like that kind of thinking, because that would actually allow a flourishing of society as opposed to retreatism. That's my thinking. I'm thinking out loud here.
Well, I also grapple that
It
as
would
well.
always be difficult because of the courts. I understand that, but we need a Caesar, and that's what Trump was supposed to be, and we've gotten nothing in the way of law and order.
We've got like a bargain Nero instead.
Yeah, bargain, perfect way of putting it. Yeah, it's like,
honestly,
anyway.
This is something that I do grapple with and this is also me getting kind of LARPy here, coming from like a very like Latin American background. Like I like the idea of a strongman, like a caudillo type. Like I like Francisco Franco. Yeah, Bukele. Yeah, I also like cities in general because I lived in Santiago, Chile for several years, and I liked the walkability and how it was actually like surprisingly safer than a lot of American cities. And it's like a second world city at that, and still was very safe. Lots of high culture. You could walk around like that. And I do think that, yeah, the point you raised that what the cities that whites built,
that it should just be handed over to savages.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I tend to take more like the let 1,000 ideas and projects bloom in the sense that people can like build their little statelets, but also I'd say like you could have like a reconquista model where like in the case of like Spain, it took them 700 years to expel Islamic and Jewish interlopers.
That's a good
and it's
point.
going to be a protracted battle. But I actually am more amenable, especially to the idea of like retaking certain cities, especially if you live in like a red state that's like thoroughly red. Like there is no real excuse for some of these cities to like fall by the wayside because you have the kind of like the capital and manpower of like voters and activists to like clean up these cities, even if the demographics of the cities themselves are bad.
I think
I
think Dallas and Miami are the two perfect examples of that. I think in Dallas and Miami, you have two cities. Dallas is larger, obviously. The reason I use Dallas instead of Houston is because Houston's demographics have been black since before I even before you even can even go back far enough on the time scale. They've always Houston has always been a largely black city. Dallas, that's where I'm from, so I know it a little better. Dallas is firmly red, aside from the immigrants that we've imported and the maybe 15 to 20% black cohort within Dallas. As we know, the Hispanics can be made red with using their opposition to blacks because Hispanics don't particularly care for black. I know we're talking right now, but Hispanics and blacks.
Oh no, I've written about this.
They clash over the same territories. We see that in LA. Dallas could become that kind of place. All the suburbs around Dallas are redder than red. Southlake, Colleyville, Grapevine.
Yeah, 100%.
These are white strongholds. These are places where if you cross the county line notoriously, if you get caught doing a crime semi-close to the Collin County, Dallas County line, your lawyer will fight for, regardless of your race, your lawyer will fight for you to be heard in Dallas County because he knows you're going to get an easier time.
Yeah.
If you get tried in Collin County, good luck. You might get a year for a drunk drive or for a possession.
Yeah, you're done.
Dallas could be, and I don't know the Miami demographics as well. I'm just saying that, like, you know, Houston is the fourth largest city in America. Dallas is like the eighth or ninth. Dallas is the kind of city that could be reconquisted. You know what I mean? If there was a will. And that's always the thing, is where's the will, you know?
Well, here's the thing. I've written about this too. And Miami, one reason why it has trended Republican over the last 20 years is because of the Cuban demographic, because they and not just like the political, but also like the street level like clashes. That people forget this. In the 80s, there were de facto race riots between Cuban cops and black residents of Miami, and there was a lot of crackdowns there, and they really dropped the hammer there because of the changing demographics of the city. Because as it grew more Hispanic, the Cubans in particular are the most organized Hispanic demographic by far in the United States, and they were able to really clamp down on a lot of that behavior. And you mentioned LA, and this is like the funny thing, like that's pretty much Hispanic and to a lesser extent Asiatic demographics changing the city wholesale. Like Compton is no longer like the black hip hop city that people associate it with. It's Hispanic now, and black gangs, Hispanic gangs, like pressed, like de facto ethnically cleansed a lot of black neighborhoods there. That to the point where, Obama had like step in with like RICO charges to bust up like some like Hispanic outfits there because they just were taking over the streets and pushing people out.
I mean, for how big, bad, and tough these black gangs love to talk about how that, you know, we'll put a cap, or I don't even know how they talk anymore, but they love to talk big, bad, and tough. Until, I mean, Chicago, we saw this recently with the Venezuelan immigrants. When Tren de Agua was doing their thing in the interim when we were moving between Biden and Trump, there were videos of the O-Block black saying, let a Venezuelan try that here in Chicago. We'll meet him with them switches. And it's like, dude, that's not true. The Venezuelans are actually organized. And I think the average IQ in Venezuela, this isn't a dig on, you know, we're talking about honesty. Venezuela has the lowest average IQ in South America, and it's on par with African Americans.
Yeah.
So it's not even an IQ thing. It's that they're more organized and that they actually have the ability to like fight and like kick you out. So this whole thing of like, we'll step to them Hispanics. I haven't seen that play out. I've never seen that play out, actually. All I've seen is blacks get routed from their hometowns, actually.
Yeah, blacks, they in this really weird way, I'd even argue that a lot of these island blacks and Africans are even more organized than the so-called foundational black Americans, because they've blacks in the U.S. have become atomized in a unique way that they're just
uniquely American way.
Well, in a unique way where they're just like mindless consumers, and they just cannot really organize very well. They can like bitch collectively, but they cannot build something like that's coherent to push
Correct.
back against these type of groups. Because let's be honest, Hispanic gangs and these other criminal enterprises, they're a lot more organized because they're coming from cultures that, even though they're pretty messed up, they still have like a social cohesiveness to them. Like if you go to
Yes.
Latin America, you'll see that like, yeah, these societies are poorer and they have like they do some weird stuff like syncretic forms of Catholicism and all that, but like they still have like an underlying culture that's not atomized. So when they come to the US, they have that advantage where they can easily take over a block, whether it's like a gang or just a group of like Hispanics, or, and I'd say a lot of other non-white groups too. Like they can just take over a block pretty easily through legitimate or illegitimate means, because the US, and you see this across the board to varying degrees, obviously, is a global consumer imperium that is marked by high levels of deracinization. And that creates these dynamics where these migrant groups that are effectively, like as I said before, golems for organized Jewry, they can just take over spots easy, like it's no one's business. The funny part is with this whole, why this whole project is gonna like start unraveling, is their children, the children of these migrants and their grandchildren, they eventually start Americanizing themselves, and then like they just become part of this like multiracial blob of like mass consumers.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you even saw, like, are you familiar with the movie New Jack City with Wesley Snipes?
Yeah.
Yeah. You almost, not even almost, that was a pretty accurate representation of like New York in the 90s and late 80s. Blacks did have the ability to control a block. But again, exactly like I was saying earlier, with relation to the 50s and 60s and integration, blacks could control a block when it was a 60-year-old white person neighborhood, and they could just kick them out using fear. They aren't able to do that when you have something like integration, where they have to go up against the triads, the Hamongs, the Latin Kings, the Train de Agua. They don't have that ability. As much as rap music has lied to them and made them feel tougher than they are, it's not there in any meaningful sense, you know?
The funny thing about rap music too is that you have a lot of these like Puerto Rican and Dominican, like mixed race, like Puerto Rican and Dominican blacks that like take like appropriate some of the stuff of like the ghetto culture and use it to their own end to like advance like their like Latin culture. And it's like they're just getting played like across the board. Like
Oh yeah.
the disproportionate amount of like Dominicans like in the rap game is it's actually like kind of fascinating how they like almost like they're doing what ghetto blacks were able to do like in the 80s and 70s, but like even better, like of taking over these blocks. And yeah, I mean that's the whole thing about the system in general, that it's just a system that creates like societal destruction is really at its core. When you have like a multiracial society, that society is just or lack thereof, to be honest, is just like destined to become a really incoherent polity marked by just social chaos.
Absolutely, man. It's I mean, when you zoom out a little bit, we've kind of been getting in the weeds here for about the last 30 minutes, which I could do this all day.
I enjoy.
I need to wrap up here soon, but
yeah, same here. Yeah.
Kind of how I wanted to trail off, I guess, is when you zoom out a little bit, it's like, why should any of the problems that we've been talking about for the last 30 minutes be white people's problem? If they don't want to live among this disaster of a situation that we've been talking about, I don't see how it's not their right to just exclude themselves from this. But every time they do, there is some government agency or through Jewish manipulation. I would say that it's, I wouldn't call it 50-50. I would say that there's also an angle of like HUD, urban housing and development, the department, the HUD department. Anytime people wanted to have a predominantly white society or city, next thing you know, there's affordable housing, Section 8 that gets moved in. There's no way right now for people to self-segregate if you're white. And that is one of the things that I've always advocated for, like I said earlier, is absolute freedom of association. I think that that's the only way out of the short-term problem that we're in right now.
No, I think this is yeah, I agree with you. This is a great place to just like wrap this conversation up because I think this is a great like high note to end on because I'm big on building solutions and I see this as one of thousands of solutions that we can build
Totally.
through like freedom of association because it's not just like solving a problem, but it's actually challenging one of the fundamental precepts of the Judeo-American experiment that has gone off the
our foundation myths. Our two foundation myths are slavery and the Holocaust. Those are what they are. And if you want to even dig into slavery, the foundation myth within slavery is Emmett Till. The idea that a black guy has the right to sleep with white women. That is the foundation myth behind Emmett Till. And when you zoom out, it's slavery, and when you zoom out further, it's the Holocaust.
Yeah. This is some like heavy stuff, but these conversations have to be had. They have to be had because we cannot continue using played out political strategies of yesteryear. But before we leave, man, let my audience know where they can follow you and your work. You've got a good YouTube channel that's popping off, and I've tuned into every episode.
Thanks, man. I didn't know that. I didn't know you watched the episode. So I do a weekly show on my channel. It's youtube.com/Jordan B videos, JORDANB videos. I do a weekly show there. I sometimes clip segments where Richard Spencer lets me go off for about 10 minutes or so. You can find my videos there, including this one. And then the Twitter is x.com/Jordan. Same thing, Jordan B videos, but the O in videos is a 0. I got banned and had to make a new account. So X is Jordan B VIDE0S. YouTube is youtube.com/Jordan B videos. I really appreciate you having me on, man. Seriously.
No, I knew this was going to be good, and I look forward to future like collaboration projects because I think we're onto some interesting stuff. And to my audience, as always, thank you for your generous attention. And with that, El Nino has spoken.